A couple of years ago, a new neighbor moved in, rented a house just up the street from us, and we invited he and his wife to come over to get acquainted. So, and I'd heard that they were both musical. And when he walked in the door, the first question I asked him was, "Hi, what's your name?" He said, "I'm Nico Carpentieri." And I said, "So I understand you're a musician. What kind of music do you play?" He said, "I play flamenco guitar." I had just put down my flamenco guitar, and the chances of finding two people who play flamenco guitar in the same town, let alone as neighbors, seems to be astronomical. But then I discovered that actually he really plays flamenco guitar. I dabble at it, um, and we discovered that Nico had just arrived. He from he'd spent a year in Barcelona, and we spoke Spanish. Then I discovered that he'd spent time studying Arabic in Granada, and I never really got his full background academic credentials, so I'm afraid I can't tell you where he got his degrees. I know he's had Harvard in his resume at some point or other, and I know that he is now chairman of the UConn Department of Islamic Studies. And other than that, I will let Nico introduce himself.
Oh, thank you, Tom. Well, I have very fond memories of that day and my amazement in finding, a fellow flamenco guitarist just opposite, just across the road from me in Dunham Pond in Stores. That was very unexpected. Well, yes, my name is Nicola Carpentieri, Nico Carpentieri, and my specialty is Arabic literature, medieval Arabic literature. I'm particularly interested in the poetry written by Arabic speakers in Spain and in Sicily, in the Western Mediterranean. And I find this particularly interesting because this poetry has very intertwined, its roots are intertwined with what we perceive to be the roots of our own Western culture and literature. I became interested in Arabic literature in Spain while an undergraduate, and I had a chance to be at the University of Berkeley for an exchange. And then I went on to study my PhD at Harvard, where I specialized in Muslim Sicily and in the poetry of Muslim Sicily. Why is it so important to talk about places like medieval Spain and medieval Sicily? I think it's particularly important to kind of deconstruct, to break this construct that we have about East and West, about our Western culture springing from, a variety of sources such as classical Greece, Rome, and then moving on into the Renaissance. Well, if we do this, we overlook a very important portion of our own history, and that is our debt towards Islamic culture. Throughout the Middle Ages, the cultural motor of the world was Islam. A famous historian has referred to Islamicate societies. This is a very ugly word that I don't like to use, but Hodgson, this historian, referred to Islamicate, meaning societies that gravitate around an Islamic government, if you wish, but whose culture is not necessarily bound to religion. And so we think of poetry, and when we think about Arabic poetry and we start reading Arabic poetry, we find all sorts of infernal activities, I call them, wine drinking and sex with persons of different sorts and orientations, and transsexuality, bestiality, rape, is particularly of young boys, very, very commonplace in Arabic poetry. You name it. Drug use, drug abuse, everything is there. So how Islamic is that? Not very Islamic. We also think of science astronomy, medicine, the furthering of Hippocratic medicine was carried out for 6 centuries by Muslim scholars from Baghdad to Cordoba. So when I was in school, well, we studied Italian literature, and we kind of begin Italian literature with Sicily. In the Middle Ages, there were troubadours in Sicily. They came from France, and they were singing their songs in Provençal. And so Sicilian poets and entertainers copied them and started writing in their own vernacular, Italian. From there, their poetry moved on into Tuscany, and it was copied by people like Dante and Boccaccio. And here we have the birth of Italian literature. Nobody bothered telling me that for over 2 centuries, almost 3 centuries, in Sicily, before the Provençal poets even came, Arabic poets, Muslim poets, were composing the same love songs that were then sang again by people like Dante and Boccaccio with the same themes. So my thought was like, there's something missing here. And what is missing is scholarship that is conversant with Arabic, that has access to the Arabic. Now, these are very difficult poems to translate. They're very obscure poems. And so the fact that scholarship conversant with Arabic was not available created a narrative of the birth of Italian literature, and for that matter, of European culture, that was partial, if not mutilated. So what I see my job as a medievalist, what I try to teach my students, that, okay, we kind of want to stop thinking about boundaries of East, West, Christianity, and Islam, and think that for many centuries in the Middle Ages, Islam, Christianity meant very little to people pursuing literature, culture, science. And that Arabic was a lingua franca comparable to what is today English. Everybody had to know it. For many, many centuries, from the 9th century to the 14th century, Arabic was the language of knowledge. So this is why I think Sicily is important. It's one of these contact areas whereby Europe absorbed from Islam knowledge in a variety of fields. It absorbed in medicine, geography, astronomy, but also literature, and what the Arabs refer to as adab, A-D-A-B, and that is etiquette, manners, sophistication. And this, in Arabic, is a central value of Arabic culture. And adab, in fact, is translated not only into manners, but also into literature. So adab really is literature. So today I'll be talking about history. I'll also be talking about literature and perhaps a little bit about music. I'd like to start sharing my screen so we can have a little bit of. Now, I wonder if you can see this. Is it visible? Yes? Right. So let us begin. So this is an excerpt from the Tabula Rogeriana. It's a collection of maps representing the whole world. And it was compiled by a Muslim scholar by the name of Idrisi, mid-12th century, in 1154, in Palermo, here, for a Norman king, not for a Muslim ruler. Idrisi was working for the Norman kings of Sicily, who ruled Sicily roughly from 1050 until, if we consider Friedrich II, one of them, 1250. So over 2 centuries. But the Normans of Sicily, very differently to what happened to the Normans in England, were not afraid of integrating their newly conquered subjects into the apparatus of their governance and also into the whole system of learning. They learn from the Arabs. Now, this is a very interesting and comparable history. As English speakers, we may be kind of familiar with the Norman conquest of England in 1066. William the Bastard, William the Conqueror, invades England and wrestles it from the various Saxon kingdoms there. At the same time, the Normans are spreading all over the world. The Normans are stanchiated here. And look how, or over here, how big northern France appears in this map. Look how important Sicily is, and Apulia, which was another Norman kingdom. They're kind of inflated, they're kind of on steroids. The king said, okay, I want these places really to stand out. And you can guess the embarrassment of the geographer having to enlarge the map. Anyway, I was saying, at the same time, the Normans are spreading throughout the world. They're seafarers, you know, they're descendants of great navigators, descendant of the Vikings, of course. And for a simple rule of inheritance, they have to move. Only the firstborn inherits in Normandy, and the cadet sons, they have to find their own way around the world. And some of them end up as soldiers of venture, as mercenaries in southern Italy. They end up conquering Muslim Sicily. But differently from what happens in England, where the Normans kind of create their castles that overlook the Saxon villages and impose their language, what they do in Sicily is entirely different. They recognize the superiority of Arabic learning, and they learn from them. And we're going to talk about this. So this tabula rogeriana here, this is just a fragment, tells us precisely of the syncretic nature of the Norman kingdom. And Sicily is here at its heart, with its capital in Palermo. But this is kind of really, I'm starting from the last chapter of our story. Now, okay, what happens here? Oh, God. Oh, I can't do it. Sorry. Let me start again. Okay. See, I'm a medieval man. I'm really bad with technology. and I can't help it. Now I gotta start over. Excuse me. Right. Okay. Okay, now it's working, but you can't see it. Off of it. Good. Right. Okay. Now, if today we walk through Sicily, well, you know, Sicily in our imaginary, among the things, from the monumental side, we're thinking about classical Greece. But if we walk through the streets of Palermo, we will find little jewels, little things that really send us back to some kind of Islamic fantasy, as if somebody, you know, had in fact recreated Islamic buildings in Sicily. This is a church, the Church of the Martorana in central Palermo, also built during the Norman age. This is a small patio in Mazzara del Vallo, a port which is in close connection with Tunisia. And you could be in Tunisia here, in fact. This again, and I'm giving you little snippets here, is a detail from a Norman palace in Palermo, from La Cuba. We call this type of decoration muqarnas. And it's, if anybody's been to the Alhambra, you know, the Alhambra is one of the most incredible examples of muqarnas, this kind of hollow spaces, recreating grottos in kind of square or cubicle spaces. Here is again more from the Cuba in Palermo. So as you wander the streets of Palermo, you kind of become aware of the Muslim past of the island, the Muslim influence of the island. This is yet another Norman palace, La Ziza, from the Arabic La Aziza, the loved ones or the dear one. We see here the element of water, very important in Islamic architecture. And we see all this in buildings that were commissioned by Normans, but obviously built by Muslim craftsmanship. This again, the Martorana in Palermo. So we here have more snippets of the remnants of Muslim culture in Sicily, physical remnants. This is a tombstone inscribed in the 4 main languages of the Norman kingdom: Arabic, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. And again, a vase, probably an ablutionary vase, and a jug and an urn, also of decorated in pseudo-Arabic. This is not real Arabic. So obviously, the second most blatant, I want to say, geographical or physical trait of Sicily, it's the sea. Sicily is surrounded, of course, an island surrounded by sea. And this brings us to its close ties, not only with the Italian mainland, with Calabria, very close to it, but also with Greece, Byzantium, and Tunisia. Okay. It's always been a crossroad. And what is most incredible is truly how different cultures, and we go back here to the tombstone, have created a sort of synergy and made of Sicily, particularly throughout the Middle Ages, a powerhouse of culture. I'm going to come back to these later on. This is a representation inside the Norman palace in Palermo of Roger II. You see in the way this image is carved, you have the monks in the back, he's drinking wine. You have a representation of a monarch that has a lot of the Islamic monarch. Even the wine drinking was one of the great characteristics of the entertainment of Islamic monarchs. But I'll come back to this a bit later on, and to the Cappella Palatina. Now, before into the history of Sicily, I must introduce to you the person who made possible for many of us the study of Muslim Sicily. His name is Michele Amari. He was a Sicilian patriot who sought during the Risorgimento in the 19th century to emancipate Sicily from the Spaniards. Because of his activities and a little opuscule, a little booklet that he circulated, he was condemned to death. And he was summoned to Naples to appear before court. He was smart enough not to go to Naples, and he ended up in Paris as a refugee. In Paris, at the ripe age of 36, he consorted with Orientalists, and he learned Arabic. And he passed his time at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, so at the National Library in Paris, uncovering anything that he could find about the Muslims of Sicily. He was convinced that this was a task that must be done, and he undertook it. And with time, he published all the available material at the time, which was most of the material we have today, about Muslim Sicily. Literature, history, geography, everything. So we owe it to this man who eventually, after the Italian independence, returned to Italy and was part of the government. We owe it to him if today we can really access Arabic writing about Sicily, but also we owe to him a very important book in 4 volumes, The Storia dei Musulmani in Sicilia, the history of the Muslims in Sicily. So Michele Amari is the real pioneer here. Right. So, where does it all begin? Well, this is the Mediterranean in the 9th century. It is, of course, a divided world. Byzantium is occupying, has shrunk a lot after the Abbasid Caliphate has conquered most of the Mediterranean. So the Abbasids are an Arabic dynasty who have established the city of Baghdad around the 800, the year 800. And from Baghdad, they rule an incredible, a vast empire, which we call the Caliphate. The Caliphate extends from India, roughly, to the Atlantic Ocean. But by the 9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate has begun to disintegrate. Centripetal forces are pulling in different directions, and local dynasties are proclaiming themselves independent. The first to go is Spain. Already at the beginning of the Abbasid conquest, the Abbasid Revolution, before the Abbasid Empire, we had a different caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus. Already when the Abbasids begin, Spain kind of breaks away. And then it's North Africa. And most of the areas that the Abbasids control in the 9th century, in the 10th century, are de facto independent. These are local viceroys that pay lip service to the Abbasids. Yes, we are your clients, but de facto do what they want. They collect taxes on the territory and they administer these taxes. So the Abbasid Empire in the 10th century is really a kind of facade that, where behind this facade, we have a very complex area in which different areas are creating their own cultural identity. And so now we have to go to Tunisia, where the Aghlabids were simply officers of the Abbasids that were appointed as governors of the province of Kairouan here in Tunisia. But by the year 900, sorry, this is a mistake, 800. But by the year 800, they are de facto independent. And it is due to the Aghlabid initiative that we will have the establishment of the Muslim colony in Sicily. What happens? Well, we have to go to Kairouan first, which is the capital in Tunisia of the Aghlabid kingdom. One day, around 825, a Byzantine officer, so somebody dispatched from Constantinople, travels to Kairouan and asks for an audience with the local emir, the local Aghlabid emir. He has a funny tale to tell. He has fallen in love with a nun whom he married. And because of this marriage, he says, the emperor in Constantinople has summoned him back to Constantinople, to Byzantium, to be processed, to be sent to court. Well, this Euphemius is not only the great admiral of the fleet in Sicily, but also the governor of Sicily. And he also says that because of this marriage, the emperor has kind of demoted him, and there's a new governor in Sicily, who's a very corrupt man. And so it all boils down to this: help me gain Sicily, and you will profit from the expedition. So Arabic chroniclers tell us about the story and the marriage of the nun. And of course, there's always this kind of cherchez la femme. There's always some woman involved into the most morbid parts of medieval history. Of course, this may well be a fabrication. But what we know is this. This Euphemius was in fact the governor of Sicily, which was a Byzantine territory. And for some reason, we infer as historians that this was probably the breaking of truces with the Muslim in piracy. He was raiding Muslim islands and he was not authorized to do so. But whatever the cause may be, whether he forced himself upon a nun and married her, or whether he was conducting illegal warfare, we don't know. He is recalled to Constantinople, and Constantinople dispatches a new governor in Sicily, and Euphemius doesn't like it. And so he goes to the Muslims. He speaks Arabic, he's got Arabic interpreters. The Muslims are his neighbors, and he's like, fine, if I cannot do deals with Constantinople, I'll do deals with the Abbasid. And so this is the next chapter. Well, the Abbasid have a truce with Constantinople. They cannot fight against the Byzantines. And so the Emir is in a predicament. What am I to do here? I kind of want to go into Sicily. It's a very rich land. It's very important also crucible. It's a very important crossroad for traffic in the Mediterranean. And what does he do? He goes to his bishop. Of course, he's not a bishop. He's a qadi. Qadi is a chief judge in Islam, but it's the most important religious figure. And he asks him for a legal opinion. Now, this is very important in Islam. You have to have legitimacy as a ruler, and your legitimacy is based on religion. It's based on Islam. And the person who legitimizes you usually is a qadi, a chief judge, who is a religious judge, who you can think of as a qadi also as a mayor. And in fact, in Spanish today, a mayor of a city is called alcalde, which comes from qadi. Anyway, he goes to this man. His name is Asad ibn al-Furat. And here you have a number of images of Asad ibn al-Furat. This is from a stamp, Tunisian stamp. I don't know, this is not Asad ibn al-Furat at all. And this is, I don't know where this is from, but this is probably the more faithful image of Asad ibn al-Furat at this time. He's a man in his 70s. And he tells the Emir that, in fact, the Byzantines themselves have broken the truce already, so there is no problem, and we should invade. And so the Emir, who clearly doesn't like this old man and the power that he has, decides to arm a big army, to form an army, and to dispatch it to Sicily, and to place the old Qadi, the old religious figure, at the head of the army as its general. And so in 827, from the port of Sus, the old Asad ibn al-Furat, the Qadi of Kairouan, embarked as an unlikely general for an expedition, together with the Byzantine turncoat general, to conquer Sicily. He delivers a wonderful speech that is reported by Arab historians, where he praises learning and kind of spurs all the presents, particularly the kids, to never slack in the pursuit of learning. And he's like, here, I am the living proof of what you can do with learning. I've done nothing but reading books all my life, and here I am, leading an army. Little does he know that his expedition will be a wreck, a total failure. They land at Mazara in 827, and the Muslim army heads for Syracuse, which is Byzantine capital at this point. They encamp outside the city, and soon enough, they all get plagued by dysentery, and the old As-ad-Din al-Furat dies. So the whole thing is now Syracuse, for anybody who's been to Syracuse, is a big port. And if you don't take the port, you really cannot take the city. But the port can be closed very easily with ships. So that's what the Byzantines do, and they don't allow for the invasion to happen. Anyway, the invasion is a failure. The Muslim armies disband, and they encamp in a little town in the mountains. They are pursued by the Byzantines, but something happens at the last time. They are rescued by a Spanish fleet of Muslim pirates that come to the aid. And it's like, look, let us partake into this conquer, and we will help you out. And so the conquest begins again. But this time the Muslims decide to leave Syracuse aside and to move west. And they move towards Palermo. And they establish Palermo up here as their headquarters. Palermo was an insignificant place before. It was a Greek city. Panormos means old port, very good port for ships, but it wasn't a very important Byzantine place. Now they conquer it in 831 and they establish it as their headquarters. So Palermo becomes the center of operations, and it will now thrive and become the great capital that we will learn about later down in history. Now, from this point, with the establishment of Palermo as the headquarters of the Muslims, the Aghlabids of Tunisia start sending more and more troops, and eventually the Muslims are capable of taking, piecemeal, moving eastward, most of Sicily. Now, the easternmost part of Sicily will never really be Islamicized fully. The center and the west are Islamicized, but Taormina and Messina remain largely Christian, and they will always be the kind of the difficult spots in Islamic domination. The island is divided into three areas: the Val di Mazzara, the Val d'Emone, and the Val di Noto. For administrative purpose, for fiscal purposes, these are three separate areas called wilayas, which means jurisdiction in Arabic. And today, in fact, we have the Val di Mazzara, Val d'Emone, and Val Noto, which allegedly comes from the Arabic wilaya. Now, what happens next? And I'm flying here a bit, but Sicily is a turbulent colony. And Michele Amari, our historian, has been very good in underlying the constant strife in Sicily. The Sicilians don't want to be administered by Cairo. And so there's a revolt after revolt against the administration in Sicily. Meanwhile, and I forgot about this, what happened to good old Euphemius, the turncoat Byzantine general? During the invasion of Sicily, is killed very early by some Byzantines who invite him over and offer him a kind of settlement, but then backstab him. So the traitor is betrayed himself. And so, in a way, Sicily becomes a land of conquer for the Muslims at this point. Okay, so I was saying, Sicily is extremely unruly. There are elements that makes it particularly unstable. First of all, there's a big ethnic divide within the Muslims that invade Sicily. Most of them are Berbers and not Arabs. The Berbers are the local inhabitants of North Africa, and they have, throughout the history of Islam, a very troublesome relationship with the Arab invaders. This troublesome relationship between Berbers and Arabs is still present today in, irredentist movement or emancipatory movements in North Africa. Now, the Berbers are kind of ruled over by Arab elites, old settlers of North Africa, that treat the Berbers pretty much as cannon fodder. They get the worst part, spoils, the worst part of the deal. And so they constantly rise in rebellion against the Arab elites that are supposed to rule over them. So from the conquest in 831 up until 900, for 70 years, if we go through the Arabic books, the Arabic history books, and the chroniclers, and these are usually chronicles arranged by year, pretty much every single year there's one big revolt, to the point that we see Sicily administered as a colony, much like New England was administered by England, by Britain, before independence. A kind of land that you say exploit, take advantage of. You use its resources, but the settlers get very little. And so Amari underscores a kind of very early sentiment of Sicilian independence in the Muslims of Sicily already. What we do know about Aghlabid administration is that these revolts were quelled in blood consistently, to the point that we have famine, successive rounds of famine depleting the populations of Sicily. So this is the image that we have of the early period of Muslim Sicily. It's a rich colony, but it's an unruly colony. But something happens around the year 900, something that will change the course of history. You probably have seen this little amulet here. It's the hand of Fatima. It's omnipresent in Tunis. And I like to think that this amulet comes from a very important period of Tunisian history. That is the Fatimid period. Now, we have to go back here to the map. Islam is not a monolithic world already early on in its history. There are many splits, and we know the main split between Sunni and Shiites. We hear about it every day in the news. Well, the split between Sunni and Shiites happens very early on, around 660. So about 40 years after the revelation of the Quran, there's already the first big split in Islam. But throughout its history, Islam fragments more and more in terms of doctrine, in terms of politics, in terms of society, in terms of geography. And so in 900, in North Africa, we have a major revolution of a dissident group called the Fatimids. It's a very interesting story. Apparently, the Fatimids are ruled by an old man, a sheikh, that lives in hiding in the desert in Syria. And he dispatches missionaries, which in Arabic we call da'i, around the world to foment a revolution and create an Ismaili Shiite nation. A Shiite nation. Let's stop at Shiite. Otherwise, Ismaili are another branch of the Shiites. So in a monolithic Sunni world, where most of the Muslims are Sunnis, this old man is trying to establish a Shiite nation. Of all the places where these missionaries are scattered, one of them ends up converting to Shiism Berbers from southern Morocco, the Ketama Berbers. And with these Ketama Berbers, this missionary storms North Africa and conquers Tunisia. He then dispatches a letter all the way to Syria, to the old sheikh, who's called Al-Mahdi, the Redeemer, who is all too happy to then travel to Tunisia and establish the Fatimid Caliphate. And of course, the first thing that he does is he chops off the head of the missionary who had created his nation for him, his country for him, because he was too powerful. But this is a very important event, because now you have two caliphates. You have the caliphate in Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliphate, who by now is really devoid of any authority. And you have a new Shiite caliphate with an entirely different doctrine, entirely different cultural tradition, linguistic tradition. And this is a big thing. It is at this time that the Umayyads of Spain in Cordoba will proclaim a third caliphate. Everybody's proclaiming their own little caliphate at this point. So you have like three Muslim empires, one in Spain, one in North Africa, one in Iraq. And of course, because Sicily is part of the Abbasid Emirate, the Fatimid Revolution has a strong repercussion on Sicily. Now, I want to just open a small parenthesis. The Fatimids are very important because eventually they will found the city of Cairo. And here you have examples of Fatimid architecture in Cairo. Cairo was not existent before the Fatimids. They will then be conquered by Salah ad-Din, but this is something that happens later. Okay, so what happens now at this point is the final insurrection. The Sicilians cut off their bonds with North Africa, declare themselves independent. Actually, they pledged allegiance to Baghdad, which is very far away and doesn't matter anymore. But eventually, they are subdued by the Fatimids. The island of Sicily is reconquered. There's a very important repression. But the rebellions do not stop there. And eventually, we come to the golden age and also the final age of Muslim Sicily with the Caliphate kingdom, with the Caliphate Emirate. The Fatimids dispatch a very important family, the Caliphates, to rule Sicily from Palermo. And when they try to depose the first of the emirs and substitute it with someone else, the island rises in rebellion, so that the Fatimids in Kairouan, in Tunisia, are forced de facto to let the Caliphate rule independently over Sicily. Now, this is the period of highest flourishing of the island, because we have an independent court in Palermo. And at this court, we have patronage of poets, patronage of scholars, and the establishment of a whole apparatus of bureaucrats, which foment Sicilian Arabic culture. And we have poetry from this period. The Caliphates are adept poets. We have poetry from the princes. And so for about a century, Sicily in this period becomes an extremely wealthy place. But alas, the Caliphate Emirate will eventually collapse. The Fatimids move towards Egypt, they move to Cairo, and so are not capable of administering Sicily properly. And so already in 1050, palace squabbles for succession ensue at palace in Palermo, and the Caliphate dynasty eventually falls. At this point, local warlords proclaim themselves independently in various regions in Sicily. And we have what we call the Typha period. And Typha in Arabic means faction. It is the period of the factions. Of course, these factions are all fighting against each other. Some of them are ruled by Berbers, some by Arabs, some by Sicilians, some by North Africans, new settlers. And their constant bickering will eventually make Sicily, weaken Sicily and make it a very easy morsel, if you want, for the Normans, who at this point in 1091, 1090, are in southern Italy. And they're looking south. They're looking at a collapsing country where the Muslims are constantly fighting against one another. And once again, the turncoat situation will repeat itself. A Muslim ruler, a local emir, a man called Ibn Thumna, the lord of Syracuse, crosses the Strait of Messina, goes up to the Normans and tells them, look, I will make you kings of Sicily if you help me against your enemies. And there the Norman invasion begins with Roger I and his Roger and Robert Guiscard. The Normans, in about a couple of decades, will wipe away Muslim military presence in Sicily, not cultural presence, and will establish their capital at Palermo and inaugurate the period of great syncretism that is Norman Sicily. So this concludes the kind of brief historical overview of Muslim Sicily. We have seen how, in the wake of the great conquerors, the Abbasid conquer, the Aghlabids invade Sicily, how Sicily is a very unruly colony that is constantly striving for independence. We have a brief golden age of de facto independence after the Calvid emirs, and then a period of decline, and finally the Norman invasion. But what remains in terms of culture, literature, and music, and what remains of Muslim Sicily in the books? Well, monumentally, we must say that not much remains. Okay? The monuments that we have, there are Arabic-speaking monuments, if you wish, are all created by the Normans. But we do have a lot in terms of poetry. And one of the great poets of Sicily, is my poet of choice, I wrote my dissertation about it, is a man called Ibn Hamdis. He hails from Syracuse in southeastern Sicily, but he makes his fame and fortune in Spain. Ibn Hamdis is born around 1056, so already when Sicily is collapsing and the Normans are waiting, laying in wait to carve their name into Sicilian history. So Ibn Hamdis, as a young man, he's an aristocrat. He wants to be a musician, he wants to be a minstrel, he wants to be an entertainer, knows that he has to leave. And he's attracted by Spain. Spain has got a great fame as a fun place with a lot of wealth for entertainers. The local kings in Spain, the kings of Typha, particularly in Seville, provide generous patronage for entertainers. And so this young man from Sicily travels on a ship to Seville and asks for an audience from the king who's a great poet himself, Al-Mu'tamid ibn Abbad. And a history book reports the tale of how Ibn Hamdis is at his wit's ends, basically, in a dirty hotel in Seville, in a pension, in a funduk, and the king is not receiving him, and he's run out of money, and so he's ready to pack up and go back. And on that very night, a page knocks at the door and introduces the king in disguise in this little room in the hotel. And there the king examines the young man with a poetic tournament. He points to the window and he says, "What do you see?" And there's a glass oven with two furnaces that are being opened in the night. And so you can see the fire gleaming through the furnaces alternatively. And so The king improvises a couple of lines on this, and this was a very common practice. It's called the ijaz in Arabic. You improvise a couple of lines, and then you ask the next person to continue. So Al-Mu'tamid improvised a couple of lines describing this glass oven as the eye of a lion in the night. And Ibn Hamdis continues the poem beautifully, talking about the eye infection that is ailing this poor lion, so they cannot keep the eyes open at once. So they keep opening and closing. So the king is satisfied, and Ibn Hamdis is admitted at court. And for about 20 years, Ibn Hamdis lives the dolce vita of the Spanish court. There's wine drinking, there's promenades along the river in Seville, wealth, sophistication. Is even given a slave girl whom he will fall in love with dearly, and whom he will lose in a shipwreck traveling to Sicily years later on. And he writes beautiful elegies for this woman, Jawhar. So Mary hears, but never will Ibn Hamdis forget his beloved island. And he will write about his island in his poems called the Siciliyat, the Sicilian poems. This is a poem that I've translated by Ibn Hamdis about Sicily. You have braved the horrors of the sea, perils from which no one is safe. Your ship tossed from east to west, from north to south. But worse than sailing the seas to me are the events that forced you to leave. And of course, Ibn Hamdis is here referring to the Norman conquest and even to the civil war that undermined Muslim Sicily from within. But from Ibn Hamdis, we have mostly poems about merriment, wine drinking, night parties, and gardens. Is a particularly crafty and very good poet of description. He's good at describing particularly nature. He has a keen interest in insects, in flowers. And this is a poem about a night party in Seville. A lovely cupbearer extends her hand, offering you the wine as your bride, garlanded by a necklace of bubbles, pouring pure sunlight upon jujube fruits. You recline on her breast, aroused by her songs, and your cares are dispelled. Her art fills our bodies with the spirit of music and cheer. As her pick plucks the strings, her hand whispers a sorcerer's spells. And here we make the acquaintance of one of the great figures of the night entertainment of the kings in Islam, and that is the qaina, or the singing girl, a professional slave girl who is trained to entertain, to have good conversation, to play music, and to recite poetry. You can think of it as a kind of geisha figure. And here again, Ibn Hamdis describes a platter of oranges. Hurry to your morning draught and mix the voice of the wine with the sound of the songs. Behold the oranges piled on a plate, close together, cheek to cheek. I marvel at how burning red embers were picked in lush gardens of green. This is Ibn Hamdis' art at its best, really. The description whereby you pick some kind of natura morta, some kind of, if you want, dead or still life, that's what I want to say. And you give it life, you make it alive. Right. I also want to quote from one of the poems of Ibn Hamdis that he writes about Sicily and the end of Muslim Sicily. And this is, I'm coming to the end of my talk here because I want to compare it with a different account of a Muslim traveler that in fact will travel about 50 years later to Norman Sicily and will describe it. Ibn Hamdis writes about civil war and the Norman conquest in these terms, and he's writing in exile and thinking back of his beloved island that's been usurped by the Normans. Saqallahu himat al-gharbi la ba'da hamihi. This is the poem. May God quench the burning thirst of the West, not the tears of those who weep in remorse, prevented from falling asleep like someone bitten by a snake. Now, this is a kind of very obscure line. If you are bitten by a snake, the only care of your companions is to keep you awake. If you fall asleep, you will die. That's the idea. And in this line, Ibn Hamdis is saying, I am keeping Sicily alive by talking about it. I will not let Sicily sleep. The memory of Sicily will live on in my verse. This is what I'm doing. He writes, I would not be pleading rain on the West, were it not the Sicilies there, and let her detractors say what they wish. Now, you plead rain on a place as a form of blessing. When you want to call blessings upon someone, especially somebody who's died, you call the rain upon it. You call the rain upon the tomb. This is it's called the istisqa in Arabic poetry, the invocation for rain. And rain is the ultimate sign of fertility. So you invoke rain upon the tomb of the dead. He writes, I am one of them. I'm one of the Sicilian. But a malicious slanderer pushed us apart. We were afflicted by internal discord to the point that we thought that wanting anything else but transgression was itself a crime. One of our youth got jealous of his very own property. His brother killed him as an enemy. And this is a reference to the princes who were bickering over the succession in Sicily. The guidance of my people went astray. Even the repentant man was plunged into crime. So the poem goes on and it describes how the Sicilians trespassed, how the Sicilians called their doom upon themselves. He writes, our own people harmed us, our numbers waned, the cold wind killed us, and the sandstorm destroyed us. And here is a reference to the Normans, the cold wind coming from the north, but also the Africans, the Tunisians, the sandstorm coming all against the Sicilians. We were inadequate for seizing glory. We were treacherous. We dragged the tails of our clothes like snakes upon which an ostrich had laid its eggs. This is a very beautiful line. The ostrich egg is a symbol of blessings. It's a blessed symbol, and it's something very delicate. So he says, we were like snakes upon something that was very delicate. And the very delicate thing, of course, is Sicily. It's the island. Anyway, I can't read the whole poem. It's a very long poem. But it's also a narrative about the woman. Ask me about the Franks. They came towards us, but we fought them. And eventually, we lost this war, but we were brave. So throughout his life, Ibn Hamdis and other poets of the diaspora, poets that left Sicily when the Normans invaded, will cast invectives against the Normans in the poems. Will try to keep the memory of Muslim Sicily alive. But here we come to the final page about Muslim Sicily. And that is the irony in this story. And the irony in the story is that Muslim culture and Arabic culture shone at its highest precisely during the Norman age. Travelers to Sicily described it as the wealthiest place in the Mediterranean, right before the Norman conquest and during the Norman era. One traveler to Sicily says, he says many things about Sicily. One of the things he says is that the Sicilians are all stupid. And the stupidity of the Sicilians is proved by the fact that there are so many teachers in Palermo. And as everybody knows, teachers are the stupidest of all mankind. How can I not sympathize being a teacher myself? Well, the fact is that this particular traveler, a very funny account, says that everybody wants to be a teacher in Sicily because if you're a teacher, you don't go and do jihad, you don't go on holy war in Calabria, you don't go and fight in the army. So everybody is a teacher, and that Palermo is full of unemployed teachers. But he also says that Sicilians are so wealthy that everybody has its own little mosque, and everybody wants their own little mosque to pray on their own. And he even describes two brothers that would not ever go to pray in the same mosque, and they all have their same little mosque. Now, this is very eccentric. This is very unique. So Sicily is wealthy. It produces paper. It produces silk. It's en route to the spice trade with the East. And here is what the 12th century traveler Ibn Jubayr has to say about the Normans. Now, Ibn Jubayr, let me see. Is a young man from Granada. In the 12th century, he is basically tricked into drinking wine. That's what he says. But the person who tricks him, who was a very rich prince, repents of having gotten him drunk and gives him a sum of money to go on pilgrimage to Mecca to atone his sin. And so that's what Ibn Jubayr does. He travels to Mecca. But as he returns home to Granada, he really takes his time. He wants to see the world. He's a young man. And so he stops around and he writes a beautiful book, this book, The Travels of Ibn Jubayr, where he describes the places he's seen. He visits the pyramids, he visits Beirut, he visits Kairouan, Mecca, Medina, of course. And he is, as he is returning to Granada, his boat is shipwrecked. And as it happened, his shipwreck is one of the most treacherous passages of the Mediterranean, the Strait of Messina. Now, what happens next is quite incredible. The Muslim boat is sinking right opposite Messina. And Christian ships, now let's recall that this is a Norman island now, come to the rescue. But, of course, being Italians, the first thing they do is they ask money for a bribe. You want to be safe? You got to pay us. And the Muslims are sinking. And at this point, the royal corvette, the royal ship, with the king himself on board, travels towards the Muslims and pays the sailors and the fishermen in order for them to save the Muslims. And this is an account of Ibn Jubayr, who is now rescued by the Norman King William, about Norman Sicily. He writes, "Their King William is admirable for his just conduct and the use he makes of the industry of the Muslims, and for choosing eunuch pages who all, or nearly all, concealing their faith, yet hold firm to the Muslim divine law. He has much confidence in Muslims, relying on them for his affairs and the most important matters. Even the supervisor of his kitchen being a Muslim. and he keeps a band of black Muslim slaves commanded by a leader chosen from amongst them. His ministers and chamberlains he appoints from his pages, of whom he has a great number, and who are his public officials and are described as his courtiers. In them shines the splendor of his realm for the magnificent clothing and fiery horses they display. And there is none of them but has his own retinue, his servants and his followers. The king possesses splendid palaces and elegant gardens, particularly in the capital of his kingdom, Al-Madina, that is Palermo. In Messina he has a palace, white like a dove, which overlooks the shore. He has about him a great number of youths and handmaidens, and no Christian king is more given up to the delights of the realm or more comfort and luxury loving. William is engrossed in the pleasure of his land, the arrangement of its laws, the laying down of procedure, the allocation of the function of his chief official, the enlargement of the splendor of the realm, and the display of his pomp, in a manner that resembles the Muslim kings. His kingdom is very large. He pays much attention to his Muslim physicians and astrologers, and also takes great care of them. He will even, when told that a physician or astrologer is passing through his land, order his detainment and then provide him with means of living so that he will forget his native land. This may have been the case with Idrisi, the geographer. May God in his favor preserve the Muslims from this seduction. The king's age is about 30 years. May God protect the Muslims from his hostility and the extension of this power. And you see how this is a very ambivalent kind of narrative. Ibn Jubayr admires the king, and at the same time, it's like, oh, God forbid that I should like this, but I like it. And he carries on. One of the remarkable things told of him is that he reads and writes in Arabic. We also learn from one of his personal servants that his motto is praise be to God. It is proper to praise him. And this, of course, is a Muslim formula. And that his father's motto was praise be to God in thanks for his beneficence. The handmaidens and concubines in his palace are all Muslims. And one of the stranger, listen to this, is funny. One of the stranger things told to us by his servant, Yahya, the embroiderer, was that the Frankish Christian women who came to his palace became Muslim, converted by the handmaidens. All this they kept secret from the king. Of the good works of these handmaidens, there are astonishing stories. It was told to us that when a terrifying earthquake shook the island, this king, in alarm, ranged around his palace and heard nothing but cries to Allah and his prophet from his women and pages. At sight of him, they were overcome with confusion, but he said to them, let each invoke the God he worships, and those that have faith shall be comforted. So these were the Norman kings. Just another couple of things before I finish. Another singular circumstance concerning these pages is that when in presence of their Lord and the hour of prayers is at hand, they will leave the chamber one by one that they might make their prayers. They sometimes do so in a place where the eye of the king might follow them, but the Almighty conceals them. So Ibn Jubayr says that the Muslim servants of the kings are not afraid to pray in the presence of the king. And it is as if God, Allah, was sheltering them so that the king doesn't see them. The last page I'm going to read. This is the interior of the Church of the Martorana with Roger II. This is the Cappella Palatina. But this is the Church of the Martorana. It's a description of this church by the very Ibn Jubayr, who visited it briefly after its construction. One of the most remarkable works of the infidels that we saw was the church known as the Church of the Antiochian. We examined it on the day of the Nativity, Christmas Day, which with them is a great festival, and a multitude of men and women had come to it. Of the buildings we saw, the spectacle of one must fail of description, for it is beyond dispute the most wonderful edifice in the world. The inner walls are all embellished with gold. There are slabs of colored marble, the like of which we have never seen, inlaid throughout with gold mosaic and surrounded by branches formed from green mosaic. In its upper parts are well-placed windows of gilded glass, which steal all looks by the brilliance of their rays and bewitch the soul. God protect us from their allurement. We learned that its founder, after whom it was named, spent 100 weights of gold on it. He had been a vizier to the grandfather of the polytheist king, the Norman king. This church has a belfry supported by columns of colored marble. It was raised cupola over cupola, each with its separate column, and it's therefore known as the column belfry. May God, in his kindness and benevolence, soon exalt it with a call to prayer. The Christian women of the city follow the fashion of Muslim women, are fluent of speech, wrap their cloaks around them, and are veiled. They go forth on this feast day dressed in robes of gold embroidered silk, wrapped in elegant cloaks, concealed by colored veils, and shod with gilt slippers. Thus they parade to their churches, or rather their dens, bearing all the adornments of Muslim women, including jewelry, henna on the fingers, and perfumes. We call to mind the words of the poet. Going into the church one day, he came upon antelope and gazelle. We invoke God's protection for this description, which enters the gates of absurdity and leads to the vanities of indulgence, and seek protection also from the bewitchment that leads to dotage. In truth, he is the Lord of power and forgiveness. So this is Ibn Jubayr on visiting the Church of the Martorana on Christmas Day. And this is a final slide with very poor images from the Cappella Palatina, which I encourage you to visit if you ever go to Palermo. This is the private chapel of the Norman kings inside their royal palace. The walls are, of course, reminiscent of Byzantine architecture, but the ceiling has been entirely constructed by Muslim workmanship. It's a beautiful Muqarnas wooden ceiling. That contains scenes of daily life in Norman Sicily. And as you can see, this is really the final testimony of an achieved and successful cultural syncretism achieved in Sicily from the 11th century onwards and up to Spanish conquest later on. So this is it. This is my talk for today. I hope you enjoyed it. There was a lot crammed into it. But if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take questions.
Does anyone have any questions? You need to unmute yourself in order to talk.
I was noticing that the late poetry referred to kind of a bloodthirstiness of the Western culture, the Norman culture, I thought.
Yeah, that's a very good point. The Normans in these poems are referred to as Uluj, the barbarians. And what this word summons up is basically somebody who's dressed in, hide and animal hide, and is pretty much eating raw meat from a slaughter animal. That's what the word conjures up. So these Normans that came, they had very little of the sophistication of the Muslim that they were going to. They were soldiers of venture. They were basically professional soldiers. So you're absolutely right. The image that they must have impressed upon the Muslims was that of savages.
When we visited Sicily a couple of years ago, and I was struck by how many artifacts of previous civilizations were still prominent, like the Greek temples of Agrigento, the Roman villa, but I didn't see much trace of the Muslim culture. Was it all erased by the after the Normans, or did they just not build monuments of that style, other than the chapel you showed in Palermo?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
that.
that's an excellent point. So the problem with the monumental aspect of Sicily is that Sicily enjoyed a golden age which was very short. It was about 50 years. And that throughout its history, most of the architecture would have been essentially military. Even when Palermo was thriving, the revolts and the successive quellings of these revolts meant that the city was dismantled at least twice, so that new headquarters could be built to better control the population. So that is why we have very little. What we do have is utilitarian architecture, like channels. The Muslim channel is very well documented. The channel system, the way water was channeled, is very well documented. It was still used by the Normans. It was a very cunning, very, very crafty way of channeling water. And then the Berbers in particular excelled into this kind of design. So what you see today in Palermo is really Islamic Norman architecture, meaning the Normans paid for it using Muslim craftsmanship and Byzantine craftsmanship. That's why the Cappella Palatina is so symbolic, because you go into a church and it's like, it's like you're in Constantinople. There's mosaic, there's gold. But then you look up and you're in the Alhambra. Mm-hmm. Two things really match. It's quite something. I think I would like to show something about, just because of what you mentioned, Tom, here. This is the Cathedral of Syracuse. The Cathedral of Syracuse. Now, of course, what you see here is a Baroque church. There's nothing particularly fancy about this. It's a Baroque church, 17th century or so. Okay. But if you start looking here to the side, it's hard to see. You will start noticing things that don't belong into a Baroque church. Let me see if I can get the side of it. Yes, so this is the side of the church. And what you see here is a series of columns of what would have been a Greek temple. A Greek temple that was later used, whose columns were later used to sustain, and you can see it here, the structure of the church. So this would be the Temple of Athena, of all things. What you see on top is a typical Muslim ornative element, which tells us that this church, after having been transformed from temple into church, was then transformed into a mosque, and that this would have been the main entrance. And finally, we revert with of course, Counter-Reformation here, and all the lovely Inquisition and Baroque style, we have the final church of Syracuse, the final cathedral. But you see here details from the inside where you can see the columns of the Greek temple. So this is I think a quite interesting remnant of Muslim Sicily. The fact that conquerors, wherever they went, repurposed the buildings. The Mosque of Cordoba was a church, and before being a church, it was a temple. But even the cathedral in Palermo, you go there today, what you see is a big church. But you kind of have to read, oh God, what is it? You kind of have to read the building to understand really what this actually was. The main entrance of the Cathedral of Palermo, the monumental entrance, is facing this alley and a part of the city that is really insignificant. To go through the main entrance, you gotta go through this kind of back alley, and it just makes no sense whatsoever. And that is why I suspect this monumental entrance was open on the side. The problem here is that this cathedral was in fact a mosque, and the main entrance of a mosque is from the large side because of the orientation. So this whole building, if we erase the cupola, if we erase this Norman superimposition, would have been the courtyard of a mosque very similar to what you would see today in Cordoba. You see, the main entrance here, the courtyard, and then the main mosque. Now, the main mosque has been enlarged many times, and then it's also been, you know, violated with this church stuck in the middle. But this is Palermo's cathedral before the Normans. You would have seen something roughly resembling this. So I think that, yeah, it's an excellent point. It's the way these buildings have been reclaimed, and because the presence in Sicily was so ephemeral, 200 years, it's not much in the great order of things. And because the reappropriation was so long that the traces are scant. Michele Amari has a beautiful final chapter of his monumental history. And the book is, and the final chapter is about food. And he maintains that, in fact, the most enduring cultural presence of Islam in Sicily is in food, particularly sweets. Confectionery is been kept in a kind of Islamic tradition. I think he has a point. I think he has a beautiful point. Anybody who's been to Sicily knows it's a very dangerous place. And not because of crime or mafia, but because of the pounds you can pile up in just a couple of days of being fed that amazing food. Absolutely impossible to stop. And the sheer quantity of it, the generosity of it, it's quite incredible.
Did the Islamic culture also? I get the impression that they were against liquor, but the poetry you mentioned all referred to wine often and copiously. Was that part of the Islamic culture during the 1000s, 1100s?
Absolutely, absolutely. Not only was part of Islamic culture, but it was a cornerstone of the culture. Particularly, of course, aristocratic culture, which is what has been immortalized in literature, really. We have very little popular literature, but even the popular literature is about wine, actually. The fact is that, you see, of course, the Quran forbids wine, but the history of Islam diverged greatly from, the original message of Islam. Early on, with the establishment of the Caliphate in Damascus, the court, the caliphal court, became very much Byzantinized. It was a second Byzantium, really. Damascus was a Byzantine city. And so what went into it was the whole paraphernalia of the Greek culture, the symposium. And caliphs entertained themselves in what we call the Majlis al-Uns, meaning the night entertainment of the kings. And this involved music, it involved poetry, and it involved wine. I always recall a beautiful page that I read while a graduate student at Harvard by a Mughal king called Jahangir, a Muslim ruler in India, who wrote, "We moved from a very humid area in India to a very dry area, I think it was Accra or something like that. And so my physician has halved my daily allowance of opium. And so now I've had to double the wine just to keep the level of stay right, so this now then when the Abbasid Revolution happens and the Caliphate moves to Baghdad and to Iraq, then the Persian influence comes, and the Persian influence, which has a very long tradition of an imperial history, of course, with the Sasanian and the Achaemenids, also goes back to the habit of immoderate drinking. And literature immortalizes this. There's a whole genre of Arabic poetry called the Khamriya, the wine ode. And it's really worth one of the great poets of wine flourished in Baghdad. Let me see here. Writes this. Let me read it for you. The poem is possibly entitled Satanic Panic. I quarreled with my boy. My letters came back marked unknown at this address, so bugger off. In solitude and tears, I damply prayed to Satan. Weeping and insomnia have got me down to 90 pounds. Don't you care that I'm suffering? That I'm so depressed? I've almost run out of lust? This obsession's getting in the way of my duty to thee. My sinning is half-hearted. I feel a fit of repentance coming on. Yes, you had better stoke up some love for me in that lad's heart, and you know how. Or I'll retire from sin, from poetry, from song, from pickling my veins in wine. I'll read the Quran. I'll start a Quranic night school for adults. I'll make the pilgrimage to Mecca every year, and I'll accumulate so much virtue that I will. Well, 3 days hadn't passed when suddenly my sweetheart came crawling back, begging for a reunion. Was it good? It was twice as good as before. Oh, joy after sorrow. Almost the heart splits with it. Oh, overdose of joy. And of course, since then, I've been on the best terms with the father of lies. This is Arabic poetry at its really best. I mean, of course, there are other types of poetry as part of the poetic canon, religious poetry, mystical poetry, but it is undeniable that the rituality of wine drinking played a central role in the development of Islamic culture. This is, you can't, unfortunately, you can't deny it.
Nico, I'm really impressed. You've given us myself a whole different perspective on the poetry of this time. It's very earthy, very human, and very engaging. It's not at all what I had sort of thought of as being very Quranic and harsh.
No, absolutely. It is not. I mean, there are very many registers. There's, for instance, I wrote my dissertation about poetry of old age, and old age was a central theme of Arabic poetics. it became very, very popular in the Middle Ages to write about old age. And it became, you know, a whole aesthetics of old age. How you talk about white hair, how you talk about going gray, how you talk about your hair going white, how you talk about things like, you know, ailments, physical ailments, backache, impotence, walking canes. All this became a whole genre of poetry. And I know it very well. As I said, my dissertation was all about this. It was excruciating. But it also talks about sex and, you know, what is, you know, what happens later, what happens when you're, you know, for instance, Ibn Hamdis, big problem. Is an old man, he's chasing girls all the time and he's going crazy over this. It's like, you know, I'm now, they look at me like I was a zero when you calculate and you don't see it because it's a zero. That's how they look at me. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So many different genres.
Oh, thank you so much.
You know, if you were here
Wow.
in person, we have a tradition of giving a cup. It's an actual drinking cup with the CLIR logo on it.
Oh,
We are holding one for you, Nico,
Bring one for you,
for
Nico.
when you come back.
please do, please do, please do. I miss you guys so much. I really miss you. I miss the place.
Well, thank you, Nico. That was just a delightful talk.
Thank you.
Interesting.
So much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for your patience. Well,